turn it on. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And yeah, so this session is meant to be more of a kind of overview of how we think about product operations certification, which is a course that's offered by the PLA. And so this is going to be going through some of the earlier sides of the content, but I do want to make this more of a discussion. So there's going to be different points. Well, I'd love to get kind of thoughts from people in the way that they end up thinking about this stuff. In particular, you know, I think I try to create a bit more focused view when it comes to product operations. I think there's a lot of different things we can do. You know, we can, I think someone mentioned earlier today, we can become basically the junk drawer for any organization, and I think any operations person can do that. And so I want to try to bring a little bit of clarity through this discussion about why are we doing the jobs that we're doing. So, what is product operations? Does anybody have an answer for that? I mean, I do, but... Lots of answers. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of those things that if product management is something that's slightly different for every organization, product operations tends to be highly customized or kind of situated inside of organizations. I think at the very basic level, I think of a few things. So one is really helping the PM team be as effective and not efficient as they can be. And I want to be very specific about that. Right? I think if we try to do things as efficiently as possible, we end up over-optimizing the process. We make decisions in an efficient way, but not necessarily for the best thing possible. And I think there's a balance here, right? I don't think it's just the ideal of you know, trying to make things as fast as possible. That's not what product management is meant to do. And I would say that product operations, when you're enabling great product management, you're enabling that type of, I guess, consideration and thought and kind of trying to figure things out. The next thing is that you end up being a steward of a PM community, right? So your role here is to help kind of prime the community. Ideally, you're not the only part of the community. Like, you shouldn't be shouting into the void all the time, and I'll talk about what that means a little bit later. But I think this being the steward of the PM community, how do we not only think about individual experiences, right, but also the experiences for the community as a whole? I think the reason why product operations can mean so many different things is because we're really, if product management is considered to be high leverage in some way, that we're kind of leverage on top of that leverage. And that means that we're even further away from really the end goal, which ends up being enabling customers. And that can cause some confusion. So I want to talk a little bit about what that means in just a little bit too. The way I end up talking about it is just PMing the PM experience. And so the way that I've ended up really focusing product management, you know, when we talk about like how should we actually look at, say, promotion of product operations people, how should we look at the way we end up doing expectations and competencies, I'm a very big advocate of actually having product operations people on the same ladder as the product managers. And that's because I believe that we're using the same tools as product managers. It's just that, and this, you know, we'll talk about this in a second, our customer is the product manager. That's the main difference. But we do everything else like a product manager would. So I really enjoy this community-driven approach. This is a book by Emily Weber. She has a lot of really great work. I just bought her newest book, which is about the team onion, which I'm going through right now. But she brings up this kind of concept of how do we build a successful community of practice? And let's maybe define what community of practice means a little bit. So in the case of product operations, right, if we're the stewards for this community of practice of product managers, first, we need to have a domain, and so the domain in this particular case is really product managers and the practice of product management. We're not there to do project management, in my opinion. We're not there to do research ops. We're not there to do a bunch of other things. Our main domain of practice is product management. Our community is actually the product managers inside of our organization, right? They're our main customer when it comes to the way that we do our work. And then finally, the practice itself, which is the reason why product managers say it depends all the time, and the reason why we probably have to say it depends, and the reason why it's so specific to every organization, is that product management practice, as applied to your context, is different for every industry, for every regulatory scheme, for every stage, and every type of product that's out there, every type of marketplace, every type of community. And so we should just be very clear about this, and that's the reason why I like to include this as a definition. The second thing, and again, Emily Weber has done a lot of really great stuff, so I love using her imagery, but this kind of difference between explicit knowledge and implicit knowledge is really important for product operations people. We're here to actually not only make the explicit more understandable and better documented, but we're here to actually build more implicit or tacit knowledge. And this is something that comes from, I mentioned Gary Klein earlier this morning about the pre-mortem, but his entire practice is about this idea of how do people gain expertise faster. And the way that they end up doing that is actually by transferring the tacit knowledge rather than the explicit knowledge between people in a better way. And so explicit knowledge in this case could be if you have a playbook, you have a procedure set, you have some type of list of process or a set of tools that people have to be onboarded into, that documentation ends up being very explicit. It's something you can write down. Tacit knowledge, however, is something that's not very easily written down. It's something that you gain intuition over time. It's something that you end up getting through the practice itself. And a lot of the time, like Gary Klein would talk about it as this idea of kind of experience prototypes that you pattern match against a current experience. And then from there, you end up trying to make kind of estimations of what information in an environment is actually helpful or not. And that's really hard to explain to someone else. And so as a product operations person, we are really here to try to create as many opportunities to spread and to basically learn implicit or tacit knowledge from each other. And this is a slide that comes from a talk that I've done called Making Learning Look More Like Work. And of course, I love 2x2s because I used to be a consultant. But I think of all of these opportunities that we should be creating for feedback cycles with our team and their other partners across the entire organization. And so I've split this up from the standpoint of, say, personal to public, as in like how big of a group of people is this going to be. You could also maybe think about it from the standpoint of like a level of abstraction. And I've talked about something called the product spine, which is how you end up kind of finding this run through of strategy to roadmap to backlog as being really important. But I think this leveling of abstraction from personal to public is very important. And then are we looking to the future? Like, are we trying to figure out things that we want to do right now? Like, I would argue that everything that product managers do in some way is a fiction, right? It's something that doesn't exist yet. It's something that will exist in the future, but we don't know what that means yet. We don't know if it's going to be successful, and we don't know how we will fail a lot of the times, right? I think the best motto for product managers is we will fail, we just don't know how yet. And then there's the past, which is when we did something, did we use a process that was helpful and effective and brought the team along and we actually learned something in some way? And so each one of these ends up being actually a process inside the product operations like world that could be a cadence of some type, right? It could be, if we're going to start thinking about strategic thinking, when was the last time that you got into a room and you actually, say, planned out the scenarios that could happen for your strategy rather than just like shoving a strategy at people through a talk? And so a lot of these times we just mistake the fact that product operations is there to just make sure that information is being kind of summarized and distributed in some way, rather than the cadences by which we get feedback from each other, we learn from each other, we build more of this tacit knowledge. So I have a question for people here. What are some feedback mechanisms using this kind of thing that you've found to be very effective within your world? I'd love to hear maybe some examples of that. Yeah, please.
Customer experience councils.
Okay, yeah. Can you explain more about customer experience councils?
So we have 8 councils separated by segment.
Okay.
Size or vertical.
Oh, here.
So we have 8 customer experience councils separated by size or segment. And we have a customer relationship manager who represents each council. And their job is to recruit the right customers to participate in the conversations. And then each quarter, we have our product leaders who determine 3 product-led topics. And we go into the councils, we ask the customers what's top of mind for them to kind of get off their chest whatever is bothering them. And then we have an open dialogue about the 3 product-led topics. It's going really good. And it's got a lot of excitement and momentum around it. The problem that I am having is that it's very siloed right now. I'm trying my best to validate what our customers are saying in the councils with the other mechanisms of feedback that are happening within the organization. and also trying to figure out like how can we better help the product managers in their decision making based off the feedback that they're collecting. So a lot of work.
Yeah, sounds like it. What else? What are the other feedback mechanisms that people have? Oh, great.
We had a quality task force, so we had multiple orgs who were looking at various, let's say, bugs. So we had UXR, we had PMM, and then we were product operations, who were looking at directly at customer feedback. And so what it allowed us to do is to find the commonalities in all of these so that we went to product. It wasn't just one group saying, hey, this is the issue. We had like 4 groups saying, hey, this is prioritized. Of all the issues we're seeing, these are the ones we all agree on.
Yeah, siloing is a really interesting problem that a lot of these types of feedback mechanisms can go after. Yeah, what else? Oh, sorry, there's one back there. Thank you.
I think the guy at the back had his hand up first. We'll come back to you. Sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. From my side, like you said, Chris, the product team is my primary customer. So I look at the director level. So we have both the hardware and software directors. So we have frequently monthly discussions with them. But we document every discussion that we have. Again, that looks at the commonalities of what their teams represent. And if you want to focus on specific product managers within those divisions, we have exclusive tasks. The problem there is product managers themselves, that their time is very much valued, and they have frequent meetings with multiple stakeholders themselves. So finding times to have those one-on-one conversations is a challenge at every point in time.
Yeah, and again, it sounds like there's a lot of like hierarchical kind of segmentation of these cadences as well, right? Which is another thing I think that's really interesting about like embedded product operations models. So yeah, just last point here, please.
I would consider experiments as a form of a feedback mechanism.
Okay. Yeah.
And then I also like anything that also helps get signals between sales and product. So any notes from salespeople around, why did we lose this sale or for product reasons and whatnot, or why did we win?
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea of retrospectives are something that I think, in the idea of like agile coaching is really the first thing that you should be doing, like from just an agile standpoint. But I think in general, when we talk about organizations, if we're not able to even understand, like, why are we not doing the best job we could, I think that feedback mechanism is something that if you don't have retros inside your organization today, you should try your best to get them inside of there, is what I would argue. So let's talk about some of the problems and that I think about when we're trying to solve within a product organization. So the first one is really disorganized work. And so every PM ends up having a different process because there's a million frameworks that exist out there. I showed you 8 of them earlier today. I'm definitely probably not helping the fact that there's a different framework for every PM that's out there. But then this zero alignment issue is one that I think is not just from the standpoint of like alignment, are we working on things that we can depend on each other for, but are we working in ways that actually help the way we do our work? We just heard a whole bunch of different feedback mechanisms that, while are trying to get us closer to the customer, actually end up getting us more siloed in some ways, right? And so there's no common way to usually share status or strategy, dependencies, roadmaps, all those types of things. Something that we struggled a lot internally to our group, which is highly technical, is actually just even producing roadmaps that every other team can understand in some way. And these problems end up creating frictions that are really what us as product operations people are trying to get out of the product management practice. And those silos exist within those frictions exist within silos that you can't always see across silo, unfortunately. I think another thing that I've really disliked about maybe working at very large organizations is usually there's this mentality of sink or swim, that when it comes to enablement, sure, we have like circles that you can go sign up on the spreadsheet, or you can join this like mentorship program, but we're not going to spend any time as a group to actually enable you to be better at what you're doing. And so, you're on your own. You have to create your own enablement program a lot of the time. I mean, inside of Google, we're very lucky we have a PM L&D team, but it's not a very big group, right, for maybe the thousands of PMs that they end up supporting. We have to grow and improve on our own time, when the reality is like the work you're doing, like this was something that I heard someone mention earlier about like reading a lot. Probably about 5 or 10 years ago, I became less afraid of just reading in front of my coworkers. And the reason why is because if you're not doing this now, right, like you're just going to be filling up the rest of your time. You're never going to have any time for anything else. Like I'm working on a very weird project that's called Design Fiction, which is like the employee manual of the future. We were talking about what would it mean for a time card where you could put like the shower ideation time down on your time card. And so like all these things we do when we go take a walk, right? Like we end up not really as product operations people. I think we should be focusing on like what is actually the full way that people need to be great at their jobs. And it doesn't mean just grinding out more hours, right? It ends up meaning like what are the most effective ways that they can do their job. I don't think we learn from each other as product managers. Probably the main way that people end up learning from each other is by observing more senior people in other meetings. And in a regular, like a GPM or a director of PM meeting, sure, you'll get together like 10 different product managers, but the main thing is just like that director of PM giving hand downs for an hour and just talking at people. When the reality is like what we really want to do is we want to learn about how people are dealing with the problems between them and their functional co-partners or cross-functionally. And so, we're very much like lone wolves inside the world. It's very rare. Unless you're actually in disagreement with another team, do two product managers exist in the same meeting most of the time? I'd also say that, by working together more as individuals, we end up building more and more trust in the way that we will be able to do our job and how we can actually call people in to get help when we need it. I don't think product managers feel very comfortable most of the time inside of organizations to ask for help from other product managers because they'll look in some way like they're not being able to do their job. And I think the thing that's most important about leadership, right, and I said this earlier today that, we can't depend on the fact that like leaders within organizations are always going to be strategic, but we can learn something from them. Almost every single leader got there for a reason. And so what we can learn from is we can learn from the mental models that they end up applying to different situations. The way that actually comes out usually inside of team meetings, though, that are not well structured, is the don't do that, do this instead. Rather than here's why I'm thinking about this in a certain way. And so I think it's product operations' job to actually allow for that type of learning to happen between different people in a product management organization. Now, partner problems are an interesting one. What I mean by this is that, engineering is usually the main partner that we end up caring about from a product management standpoint. And sometimes they're not getting exactly what they need, right? They are getting something like there's a bunch of like PRDs that are being thrown over the wall, but they're maybe not getting the support that they actually need. And so product operation, even though the product manager is our main customer, right, we still need to be able to enable these types of relationships in some way. Problems and frictions are not known again. So like if there's like siloing between different teams, there's also siloing within every individual relationship, the frictions that end up existing there that won't be brought out into like some systemic light. One of the biggest issues that I see for product operations people is the concept of bringing too much process to bear on things. And so I think like the first thing, if we're talking about like the first 30, 60, 90 days for a product ops person, it should be actually dismantling a process rather than creating one. Because there's all these times that, if we start to see bottlenecks within the world that exist there because of process or procedure that's already been created. And if you're stopping people from actually doing their job as effectively as possible, that's also your problem. I think about it the standpoint that if we're going to add some new process, we actually have to also take one away. If people are spending more time documenting things, right, they're actually like writing documents more than they're probably having conversations, I worry about that a little bit. I mean, I think we can have a discussion about what does it mean to do async versus synchronous work. And then, if there are way too many sign-offs, it means that teams can't make decisions on their own. And that means they get waylaid in being able to move process forward that makes sense for them. And then, this is where I think what's interesting, and maybe this is where I'm a dissenting voice inside of the product operations community, but I think there's a lot of times where we end up doing basically roles that should not be product operations. And so one of those is data science. We should not be building self-service data analytics services. We should not be onboarding those tools. We should have people that are professionals in data science and actually doing that type of analysis do the analysis. I don't think we should be doing that. And I realize, again, I'm probably like a divergent voice here. Same thing with user research, right? There are many, many sociologists that are out there. I'm actually presenting tomorrow at a conference called EPIC, which is an ethnography conference. There are lots of people out there that their expertise is user research, understanding what the problems are that people have, understanding it in their context, and it should not be our job to do their job as well as their partner's job, which is research operations. So, I don't know. I think like if we are going to fill this gap, that's fine if we need to do that temporarily, but our job should not be about user research. That's not our field of practice. I think ops. You know, I think this is something that maybe like, I don't mean to pick on Uber, but it seems like product ops people there are more like ops. And whoever is from Uber here, I'd love to talk to you about it later, but like, I get that feeling every time I see a presentation from them. And so I think this idea of like, you're actually helping the entire, you're being the chief of staff, right? Or you're being some type of person that is focused on more than just product, I think is more of traditional operations roles. And I don't want to take away from those roles at all. I think we're, like, maybe our tent is too big. We're not like being specific and focused enough about what our practice should be. So I'd love to have that conversation. You can buy me a beer later if you want to argue with me. And then finally, leadership, right? Like, there have been plenty of times that I've been in a product ops role where I had to write strategy, and that should not be my job either, right? I feel like I'm good at strategy. Okay, I like talking about strategy a lot, but my role should be to be there to make sure that the product team is actually doing the best strategic thinking they can to enable that through all of these feedback mechanisms, discussions, et cetera. But you should not be setting strategy as a product ops person. You should be setting strategy for how this can be an effective team. And we'll talk about OKRs a little bit later. But I think that's something I see in a lot of gaps in teams that we end up like stepping up. The chief of staff, for example, they end up doing a lot of this work a lot of the time too. And they probably shouldn't, right? It should be the leader themselves. So, problems with product ops, okay? Now that we've talked about the problems that our teams are having, there's plenty of problems that we also have as product operations people. I kind of already went through this. I'm just going to drive this point home. I usually separate this out a little bit more. But yeah, user research repositories, data analysis. I think we are not project managers, okay? That's not our job. The people that do project management, they have PMI certifications. They are specializing in reduction of risk, in not making the same mistake twice. Our job is to enable a type of people, product managers, that are there to do innovation. And there's a balance. There's an absolute balance. So inside of the team that I have right now, there is a person that does effectively project ops. And we're counterparts in the way that we end up talking to each other. And the way I end up fitting into kind of standard development life cycles end up being how should product management fit into this role, rather than the idea that I'm going to be there as like a project manager. So I think, again, there's lots of great people that are project. I almost got a PMI certification and went project management, right, at a certain point. And there's nothing wrong with that role. It's just I don't think that's what product operations should be doing. Also, we should not be doing the bullshit work that PMs don't want to do. Are there any regular PMs in here, I guess, is my first question. Okay, good. We can talk about them. Part of what happens with operations roles is it's kind of like, well, you know, we need to get this one thing done, so let's just all get together and do it, right? Product operations is more about the systemification of things. It's about, say in the world of like, there's a framework called Cynefin, which is really about how we understand what type of problem we're solving. And complex problems are a domain between people and between organizations of people. Complicated domain problems are things where we have like a good enough practice, where we've set down some rules on what to do. And our job is, as product ops people, is to keep on going back and forth between this complex and complicated, understand when we should take something from the complex domain and create a process around it, and then realizing that the process is no longer valid and going back into complex to figure it out, right? If we do one specific PM's job, we end up doing bullshit work for all of the PMs. If we think about that PM as a single point on a line of kind of experience for product managers, we build systems that make everybody's job better. So, just wanted to drive that point home. I have a PLA article about this as well if you want to read my, my longer kind of diatribe about this. There's a few self-made problems too. So we over-focus on process too much. I don't think we spend enough time kind of like talking to people, coaching them, showing them that even the practice we have can be brought to bear on their individual experiences. And I think of that as more as coaching, because to me, once I start to see all these like one-on-one types of like issues that are coming up, I can then start to up-level and understand that across this entire team, here's the sentiment that's actually happening. Again, doing the job of other groups. I promise I won't say this anymore, but we should not be doing the jobs of other, other groups. Setting the strategy for the whole org, and then efficiency as focus. And finally, you know, our customer is the product manager, not product leadership. We are not here to make sure that whatever harebrained schemed the product leader has cooked up that week is enforced on all of the product managers. And so an example of that I usually get is the first request when I join somewhere is, we need better status reporting. And I immediately ask, for what? And so our job is not here to exert the power structures that already exist within the product management hierarchy on our product managers. Our job is to make sure that whatever they need is actually helping them be most effective. So, has anybody seen any of these problems in their organization before? Okay, so maybe a few. I didn't get it, I got like half the room, so apparently everybody else has much different problems. Are there any problems that were not on this list? I would love to hear them from people. Oh yeah, please.
Hey, so I've worked in a few places now where we're actually doing the bridging between operations and product, and I think that's something, you know, you're saying that your customer is the product managers, but I've always seen my customer as the ops teams. So how do you, is there a dance there?
So I think like there's this thing that becomes an issue for any team that deals with kind of like uncertainty in their role a lot of the time. And I'd say product people, product ops people, user researchers, you know, business development people, there's a lot of uncertainty in their role. They don't have always like a very explicit thing that works every single time, right? There's no like in the case of engineering, I think once you get to a senior level, you start thinking about kind of like the very large scale architectural issues that are very hard to solve. But if you're doing like code reviews, there's kind of a way you should adhere to the code of the things that are going on. And so I would just say like, there's an author, Von Tan, I mentioned him earlier this morning, but he wrote the book called The Uncertainty Mindset. And it's a really great book from the standpoint of kind of how do we understand these like super high-end restaurants, they have R&D teams. Okay, so they come up with all the crazy dishes that are in these like 3-star Michelin places. The way that people end up joining that team is that they have some type of background where they probably are a chef of some type. They probably have some expertise in some type of like, you know, some type of material plus chef type of thing. But they don't join and they say immediately, here's how I do things, and we're gonna do it exactly this way, and here's how I'm gonna enable the team. What they do is they say, hey, here's something I'm good at, can I help you with this right now? And then either the team says, yes, that's helpful, or no, that's not helpful. If it's yes, that's helpful, it becomes part of your job responsibility. If no, it's not helpful, you find something else to do. And you do this a couple different times. And so I think this like, he calls it negotiated joining, and there's actually like a paper if you want to read about this. But I've been trying to like internalize this a little bit more as I join new teams or I take on new experiences, is how am I more kind of purposeful about this negotiated joining? And so my only point in like a very circuitous way to your question is that like there are going to be times that there's a gap somewhere that a team is actually created or a person is put inside that role because there is a real issue that needs to be resolved in some way, right? Product ops only really exists probably because of the fact that DevOps existed previously. Because there was a gap between the idea of developers doing something and throwing it over the wall at operations people, and things would just break all the time. So if there's a gap, like I would just say like, I'm trying to bring focus to some of these things, which is product ops, if we're going to call it product ops, here's kind of the main things that we want to start to standardize around language, around customer, around all that type of stuff, rather than just anything goes. And so that's what I'd say is like, if you have a hybrid job, and I've had lots of hybrid jobs, like when I was at Waze or Kayak, they were like hybrid product management and business development roles. And those are really interesting roles, but I was like very illegible as far as a person. So I think those types of things need to exist, and I would say that they should exist. I'm just saying like if we're gonna call it product ops, we should try to be a little bit more focused in the way we talk about it. That's what I would argue. Is that fair? Yeah, okay. But I love this idea of hybrid roles. I mean, I love the fact that I can barely describe what I do a lot of the time to people. So yeah. So if we're gonna be PMing the PM experience, what does that actually mean? So who is your customer, everybody? The PMs, all right, good job. People have been listening. Yes, product people are our customers, right? They're the main customer, they're the people that we should be talking to the most, that we're listening to the most, that we're helping the most, that we're really trying to be compassionate and empathetic towards, and that we're trying to actually like make their lives better, easier, give them more meaning, things like that. After that, it's partner teams. right? Like the teams that actually work with product management, we can see big problems that kind of span across the different product management people as well as their teams. And so they're our next customer. After that, it's actually product management and the people that end up doing leadership positions. We have to worry about what they think about because they kind of, you know, they're higher up in the hierarchy. We have to make sure that we don't get like blocked from promotions and stuff like that. But the reality is like they have a very different use inside the organization than what we should be helping. And then finally, probably, and it says 4 here, I would have put 99 if the bulletin just did it automatically, but we are not here to service end customers and users. That is how we start to do bullshit work for product managers, is we start to think about the end customer too much. Now, it doesn't mean that like we're here in a vacuum and we're never going to think about customer ever again, but we're not here to do things for the customer. We're here to do things for product managers. I just want to make sure that's very clear. So what is your product? What are some ideas for what our product is? What do you think? The PM process, okay. What else? A framework, okay. I mean, I definitely have some ideas, and there's no wrong answers here. This is a safe place, okay? So I would say that our first product is actually the individual product person's experience. How do they come to work? How do they do their work? How do they feel about their work? The second thing is the collective product management community of practice. And I would say that we go back and forth between these two things a lot, right? We want individuals to be able to do the thing that they want to do. We should allow for grassroots kind of development of new processes, of thinking about new things. But we also have to be worried about this idea that the entire group together are a unit of people working in some way dependent on each other. So that's why I just want to be clear about that, the products themselves are the individual experience and the community of practice. Now, the next thing I wanted to talk about, and this is actually not part of the Product Ops Certified course, this is really kind of more the introduction of that, is I want to start to talk a little bit more about metrics, because that is something that's come up a couple times so far today. And it's a very hard question to answer, but I want to try to provide a framework that I think helps build a better way for us to think about metrics as product ops people, though. So how do people here measure their team's performance today? And you can, again, either shout it out or, yeah, what do you?
Internal sentiment.
Internal sentiment? And what way do you talk about internal sentiment?
Like their job satisfaction.
Job satisfaction? Great. Very cool. Yep. What else? I think there's someone all the way in the back. I mean, do you measure? That's okay if you don't. I actually try not to be measured as much as possible.
At RD Station in Brazil, we measure the performance of our teams using some agile metrics such as lead time, throughput, and we created a kind of score that to measure the maturity of the team, if the teams are achieving their goals and something like that.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I have kind of like a love-hate relationship with maturity models, just because I think it simplifies things, like such complex things down, but I also see the value in trying to allow people to understand how they can improve, right? And I think there's something very important. We can maybe talk about it later if there's time, but about kind of during the enablement discussion we were having is how people can actually, as teams, decide where are the gaps that they have rather than other people deciding where the gaps are that they have. I think there's something interesting about that. Yeah, what else back there?
Time saved for product managers.
Yeah, what is it?
Time saved for product
Time
managers.
saved, yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, it's a hard one too to measure, right? Like part of what we think about a lot inside of our team is just like software, like the customer in this case is software engineers. And so trying to figure out how we've made their lives more effective. Product managers, it just seems so hard. Like, do you think that a product manager wants to put in a time card? I mean, I don't know if you've worked in time card places, but it's really hard. It's really hard to discern that. And so do you track that in a certain way? Like, or is it more sentiment? Okay.
I did try that, but I was having the discussion with some of the members today as well. How do you assess that with the cost, right?
Yeah.
So I think we looked at averages in terms of salaries, and then you can put a number together. But again, it's all estimation at this point in time.
No, and actually, it's like another great point is like we were talking about meetings earlier today and how actually really bad meetings waste a lot of people's time. I mean, there's a plugin I think for for Zoom where you can actually have like a money spinner at the bottom of a meeting based on the average hourly of people. So I think that's interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, we don't actually use this measure, but I was curious about having a survey question around like, on a scale of 1 to 10, do you believe that we're a world-class product organization? Something along those lines,
Yeah.
because it uncovers areas that invites a conversation.
Yeah.
And then you can focus on those areas and prioritize.
Well, that's fair. I mean, it's kind of like NPS, right? The NPS score itself is actually not that helpful, but the why did you give us this score is probably more helpful, right? I mean, is anybody out there, because I usually think of like strategy in general is usually about like 2 good choices that you choose between. So is anybody out there trying to run like a worst in class product management organization? So, I mean, I think this is the thing is we need to unpack these terms, right, a lot of the time inside these metrics too, because like why are we, like what would a high performing product management organization look like? It would probably be people like, taking a lot of walks and thinking, having lots of like really good arguments with other people, philosophizing about where our product is supposed to exist. I mean, I think like we have a really hard time with this because product management is actually very hard in general. And this is the reason why I want to like present you with a framework that I found to be kind of interesting and maybe helpful. So Kent Beck, who was one of the original signers of the Agile Manifesto, he's someone that I really love for something called the 3X model, which is really about, on an S curve, how do you understand where your product is and maybe the different type of modes for products. But he just recently, McKinsey came out with a report about how to judge developer effectiveness. And of course, this pissed a lot of people off. And so he wrote this blog post, which you can find. But he talks a little bit about what are these really, the ways that we end up thinking about metrics inside of an organization and maybe why we need to have them. And so he breaks it down into 4 different things, which is effort, output, outcome, and impact, right? And if you've ever read any Josh Sadin stuff, like outcome over output, I have like a short section on OKRs that I will like probably speed through just so you can hear what I think about that in reference to this. But what we're really trying to get to is this impact, right? Kind of everything we do before this doesn't really matter unless we get to the impact. And so the way that he starts to think about this for, say, an engineer is, ideally, you're writing a bunch of code, you're shipping it, you're doing stuff. Maybe when we talk about, like, up here for output, right, there's these things that we end up creating, like design documents of features in production. But what we really want, if we're talking about outcome, is this idea of customers behave differently, right? They do some type of new behavior that is beneficial and exchanges value in a way that's valuable. But in the end, that value that is generated is the impact that we want to have. And so I guess my question to you, right, is why do we want to measure in the first place? We can start to talk about maybe where we're going to back into this idea of impact. And so unfortunately, one of the reasons why people want to measure is because they want to know who to fire. And I'm stealing this from Kent Beck again. I want to give him full credit for this, but I want to like adopt it for what we're talking about. I don't think really product ops people are here for that type of thing. We're not here to actually do performance evaluation. We're not here to ideally even enable that. I mean, at one of my roles, I did have to help them stand up like a competency-based performance evaluation model, and that was a train wreck in trying to get implemented. The next thing is to compare to investment opportunities, right? So if we as product ops people are trying to decide which programs to look at, we can start to decide what is effective for us as well. We can actually manage performance, not in a performance evaluation way like we want to get rid of people, but more like this team is having a lot of problems, how do we help them because they're not performing in the way that we would hope that they would. Or this team is performing really well, and so we should try to get out of their way a little bit more. And then finally, I think we should also think about this from the standpoint of how do we improve our craft, right? How do we continue to get better as individuals within this practice rather than just the idea of how can we make these product managers do a better job in some way? And so I started to think about this within the framework. And I actually talk about this inside of the Product Ops Certified course, but I've started to rethink some of the positioning of these things a little bit. And so the first thing is really around this idea of like, probably effort here is us scheduling a bunch of meetings, attending a bunch of meetings. I think qualitatively interviewing people, talking to people, coaching people, like that type of thing Even this idea of like engaging with the community, posting a link about something or a workshop or whatever, those are all efforts that we end up doing, right? Creating even a process potentially. The actual processes themselves and the tools launched ends up being kind of this output that we have, rather than the idea of like, yeah, so that's the output. The next thing is, from an outcome standpoint, what we're actually usually looking for is engagement with the community of practice, right? Like, we don't have a community when it's just us shouting at the community. It has to be actually a community. Ideally, like 51% of the chatter there or more is actually the rest of the community. But we're just there to like seed things. Everything that we can learn from like the idea of, the most recent fad, kind of post-marketplace fad, and maybe a little bit after product-led growth fad, there was like the community-driven fad. But that idea of like engagement within the community, I think, is really valuable. Tool usage is something that I don't think we monitor enough of. Like, we do look at, maybe as product operations people, did people sign up? How often are they actually doing these things inside of here? But there's even more than that. So for example, inside of like Google Docs, you can start to look at activity on your documents. And so the ones that you consider to be the quintessential like main documents for your team, you are probably going to be very disappointed about the number of people that are accessing them on a regular basis. And then finally, I think this outcome, like a recent thing that we've been working on, is trying to, quote unquote, raise the bar. Of course, we always have to raise the bar in some way, but raise the bar for writing. And writing a better doc actually doesn't matter, right? Like, it's still fiction. It's still just like a piece of work that people have created, but it doesn't actually create anything better other than maybe having a better discussion or helping an engineer actually do a better job. The real impact I think we're going for, yep, and everybody can take a picture now. It's fully animated, is this idea of attrition and retention for the product management team. I think this feeling of inclusion and feeling valued within the team, and that other teams value the PMs themselves. And so there's kind of a mix here of quantitative and qualitative measures, but I think that's what we really start to get into when we talk about being like a really great product operations team, and what we should be measuring is the actual impact of what we end up doing. So, using this model, how would you rate your metrics that you collect today? Where would you put them? And please, again, this is a very safe space. There's no PMs here, just us product operations people. Let's do this. Raise of hands for effort metrics. No one's tracking effort metrics? I put velocity inside of effort, right? Okay, output metrics. Who's collecting output metrics? Okay, a few more people. Can someone give me an example of an output metric that you're collecting, if you don't mind? I won't call anybody specifically, just volunteers. There's like sign-offs that have to happen. What was that? Sorry. Sign-offs? Okay, so sign-offs happening, sign-offs being completed. Makes a lot of sense, absolutely. What about outcomes? Who's tracking outcome metrics? All right, actually even less people. I'm not going to pick on you, but you were collecting a lot of metrics. I want to hear more from you. Anybody willing to offer what an outcome metric is that they're tracking? Yeah, please.
Just a couple of examples, I guess. One is we use product board for a lot of our roadmap and related items. Okay. And so we measure utilization of that tool. Another one that we look at is for some of our Confluence pages that host a lot of the information about their product. Yep. We do look at the engagement. We don't really have a score necessarily, but we say, hey, these are some of our top product launches that we're going to have. Are these pages being accessed by the people we would want to see access them enough?
That's great. That's
so just those kinds of things, but we try not to, like, at least at this point, and I'm not really looking for it, like turn that into a score and say, your product over here had a 10, his had a 9, you're better.
Totally.
Just, no.
Now, when I've asked this to like a bunch of people that are more community experts, and I'm like, how do we judge like a healthy and vibrant community? And they're like, you don't actually measure it. Because you will know if you actually have a vibrant community in some way. And please, what do you have?
So in one of my previous jobs, we started tracking number of teams that have what we called product charters.
Okay.
So it's similar to a team charter, but instead of being people-focused, it's more focused on documenting specific product outcomes and making sure that for each of the product outcomes, there are metrics to measure them.
Yeah.
And the most important thing is actually alignment between the different functions, product engineering, UX, but also with the leadership team.
Yeah, fair enough.
And so it was a simple document, but just tracking how many teams have it in writing, signed off between sort of everybody on the team and their leaders, was an interesting metric because it became a forcing function to drive that alignment and being very disciplined about putting on paper, these are my product outcomes, this is how I'll measure them.
Yeah, that's great. Very cool. How many people are doing impact metrics? Okay, we'll talk later. But yeah, so I think like this is one of those things that's really hard for product operations to do. I would love to offer this as a framework for you to start to think about how you can actually start to back into better metrics. This is something that I think product management people are still trying to do a better job about, but still haven't yet. So really quickly, I want to talk a little bit about OKRs. And the reason why is like, I think of this as like a fairly helpful goal setting mechanism when it's done well. Does it, maybe just a sense of hands here. I want to get to questions. So how many people here use OKRs? Keep your hands up if you do them well. All right, that's what I thought. That's a problem, right, is no one does them well, unfortunately. I think one of the things that I would like to suggest here, which is maybe related to the way that these metrics actually relate to hierarchy, is that hierarchical OKRs end up having a lot of problems. And that's the way that they end up being implemented a lot of the time. So first of all, like the top of the OKRs will tend to be like, oh, if my OKR is not in the top OKR, it means my team doesn't exist. If the top one has some type of OKR, we cascade them down because every person must be working on whatever that thing is, so we have to have a piece of it. The lower teams end up inheriting essentially initiatives because at a certain point, you're no longer like really looking at the bigger objective. And a person near the top, right, they end up owning the OKR in some way that is more valuable for them maybe, right? And again, leadership has very different types of incentives versus the way that we should use them as kind of figuring out, are we building the right thing towards the objective that we're trying to use? So and then, the last thing is that there's usually just like way too many OKRs. How many people have 1 to 3 OKRs for their team? Okay. How many people have 4 to 5? For PMs right now, but yeah, for product ops, we'll talk about product ops in just a second too. But for your team, how many people have like 4 to 5 product OKRs? How many people have 5 to or 6 to 10? How many people have more than 10? Okay. So the way that I think is that we should be thinking about things instead is actually as a network. And so this is an Enron email network. I just think it's a cool network graph. But within this, we should really be thinking about the way that our teams, and especially product operations, fits within the larger network of OKRs. So some of the reasons why we should be doing networks rather than the other way is that it's much more in line with the way that teams actually build dependencies on each other. Not all teams need to prioritize the same thing. It does actually reflect the dependencies that we end up creating anyways. And we can create new work streams based on these networks rather than doing something else. And then finally, we probably also need to reorganize more often than we do because of Conway's law, but that's a different thing. So here's a really quick example, is that inside of this world, right, the organization can have a very specific set of OKRs, and the product team can share the objective, but not the KRs. Marketing can share some of the KRs, but not the objective, and so on. And then operations, and I think like product operations is the key case here, is that we should not actually be using OKRs in the same way that our product teams are. We should not be thinking about them as objectives for the customer, but for actually our own team in some way. And so an example OKR that I think about is like, product people's plans are not in alignment, right? And so as a problem, we want to now, usually the inverse of a problem is usually an objective. But a good objective has an actual person. It has some type of end state. It's ideally aspirational. And from there, we can start to then talk about the KRs, which may be, in this case, more like output metrics, because we can understand how we're moving towards a goal rather than achieving it yet. And so these are some examples of kind of like the way I've thought about this. So I know that like product operations people have struggled with OKRs an awful lot. And that's something I'd love to talk about more maybe after this. I would love to hear your OKRs and how you've maybe dealt with that. I don't really have time to talk about this just because I do want to get to a question or two, but the council meeting was essentially this thing that it was really bad. People were like quitting over this meeting. And they were spending all their time preparing a slide deck. We looked at the original goals, we broke it up a little bit, and what we ended up doing is we experimented with some changes that focused more on helping the person rather than getting a status report. And from there, we ended up actually relaunching with better results. And things like the satisfaction of the community and the various ways that people ended up doing their job was improved from a metric standpoint. So in closing, your customer is the PM. You solve the problems PMs have. Your product is the community and the individual's experience. And you should be really understanding these dependencies through a network rather than from the standpoint of a hierarchy. And please get Product Ops certified today. And that's it. So yeah, I'd love to ask questions. Thank you very much for listening to this, and I hope it spurred some new ideas for you. So yeah, what types of questions do people have about product operations? And we have a little bit of time, but please stop me when we're out.
Just curious, I don't know if you spoke about this earlier today already, but what is the traditional career path you've seen for product ops people in your experience?
Well, I mean, I guess it feels like it's a rarity for people to come from product management into product ops for some reason, but it does seem like it's much more like from customer success or ops, or I've actually seen some people come in from like product marketing management and stuff like that. But I mean, I think like really anybody that is going to be obsessed with solving a customer's problem, which is the PM's problem, like the internal customer, I think there's a lot of things that, of these different flavors that people come from, right? Like customer support people are probably much better about like trying to understand all of the little pieces of feedback and how they actually like roll up into a bigger thing that needs to happen, versus the people that are more ops are like, what is the strain of process on the people that are actually doing things? And so I wouldn't say that like, you know, my background is product management and business development and a few other things, but like I would say that my product management background is no more valid than another person's that's coming into this. I just think that as a product ops person, it actually behooves you to understand lots of different frameworks and processes and procedures that are out there, because there's no such thing as the perfect framework. And there's no framework or process that's going to work for every single team here. And so doing some way to be aware of all these things and allow for experimentation of them, I think that's part of your job as a product ops person though. So you do need to be aware, but you don't have to come from that background. I mean, honestly, most product managers come from like wildly different places as well. So it's kind of like a mutt of a, like a background anyway. So I would just say like for product ops, I think it's the same type of thing. Yeah. Cool.
Chris, in any moment of your presentation, you talked about business indicators, and it brings me some mental confusion in my mind because...
Well, but these metrics, they've got to be getting like 20% more profit for our team or something like that, right?
I mean, it's a little bit superficial, but in our company, the main role or the main problem that we solve as a product operations department is connect the business result with product result, isolating the scenarios, understanding how this feature, this use case, this feedback that our customers bring us, we solve using a solution, and the solution creates some positive effects in the business. In your opinion, what is the responsibility of product operations with business indicators?
Well, so I mean, I think like product management's job is to actually understand the business value that's being created in some way. They may not always be the experts in business value, right? There may be finance people or business model experts, right, that end up doing that. But I think that's, again, where we're kind of mistaking the role, in my opinion, and lacking the focus, right, which happens in a lot of organizations, right? Like I'm going to say that you're at no fault if you end up having an organization that does all these different things. But if product management is not thinking about linking the business value to the product, it's kind of like the idea that there's a separate strategy for the organization and there's a separate strategy for the product. I don't think that's the case. And the reason why is because if you have those two separate things, that means you're making decisions in potentially different ways that, you know, help different parts of that. And so I think that's the issue that I start to see, is that if there are more of these gaps, and again, just going back to the question about kind of like being the partner of like an ops team or something like that, if you see a gap, you will sometimes have to fill in that gap. But I would argue that I think that misses the point of like product management in the way that they're supposed to be able to do their job. If you're going to do that as a specialty for product operations, I just think you're kind of doing the product manager's job in that case. And I think you're going to mistaken their customer for your customer, which is going to cause you to make different decisions than you would have otherwise. And that also means like grinding it out, doing the BS work for product managers rather than doing the more systemic understanding work that you could be doing. So that would be my point. Everybody's context is different, and we all have to exist within the organizations we exist. So there's no fault here. I'm trying to bring focus, I think, is the only thing I like to say. Yeah. Yeah. One more? Okay. Who hasn't asked a question yet? Think. All right. Who? Over here. I appreciate you saying that my presentation was perfect.
This is what I want to, this is like the next role that I want. I was ex-Meta, and it was all about the customer voice. It was just customer feedback, customer feedback, customer feedback. Like, as I'm like interviewing for roles, everyone's still stuck in one aspect. Like, what percentage of companies actually do this?
Well, yeah, I get this question a lot. I would say very few. But what I would say is that it's not our job to create mediocrity. It's not our job to just kind of do whatever the organization is already doing. So it doesn't mean that we will work within perfect organizations at all. But it does mean we can continue to strive for something that's better. And I would argue that actually for great organizations anyways, there's always different problems that are coming up, right? Like even if you start to move really fast, you need to slow down sometimes, right? And if you are too slow, you need to speed up. So I would just say like there's cycles and there's all these things that like there's never such a thing as a perfect organization. It never exists because humans are involved. And so I would just say like we shouldn't beat ourselves up about this. But when we start to like apply this idea of like this framework of like we should be choosing these types of things over these types of things, or that like we're going to try to link all of this lattice work of like philosophy for why we're doing our work together, I think we end up making better decisions overall, even if they're not always going to be perfect. And so I think that's okay. I just want to, I would like us to just do a slightly better job is what I would like us to do. And I'm sure all of you can do that. So thank you very much. I'm out of time. Yeah, thank you.